The sound came first, low and heavy, shaking the glass panes in their frames. Rafi opened his eyes, unsure if he was still dreaming. But then the roar grew louder, joined by the grind of gears and the beeping of trucks backing up. He pulled on his boots and stepped outside, heart already sinking. The valley below, where his orchard once stretched wide and green, was no longer silent. Huge machines rolled across the soil, tearing through the earth as if it had no history, no memory. Dust rose in thick clouds, covering the morning sun. Men in bright vests waved their arms, pointing where the fences should be set. Wooden stakes went into the ground, one after another, marking lines that cut across the land his family had walked for generations. The air smelled of diesel, sharp and cold. Rafi gripped the fence post near his gate until his knuckles went white. He knew the fight was over, at least on paper. The letters, the meetings, the signatures he never gave, none of it had stopped them. A black SUV pulled up by the ridge. A woman stepped out, holding a leather folder close to her chest. She smiled, but the smile did not touch her eyes. She walked toward Rafi with slow, careful steps, as if she knew what he was thinking. She held out the folder, opening it just enough for him to see the map inside. 35 lots, neat and numbered, laid over his land like a cold blueprint. She spoke with a polite voice, rehearsed and sharp. The development is moving forward. Please stay clear of the work site. Then she turned and left, as if that was the end of it. Rafi's chest tightened. He looked past the machines to the ridge where the old stone marker stood half-buried. It had been there longer than he had been alive, a weathered block with faint letters carved into it. The morning light touched the surface, making one word just visible: reserve. No one from the HOA had mentioned it. No one seemed to care. But Rafi's grandfather had spoken of it once, long ago, in whispers meant only for family. He remembered those words now, though they felt more like a warning than a story. The machines did not stop. The land shook with their weight. Men shouted, engines growled, and the sky filled with the sound of change that could not be undone. Rafi stood still, every muscle tight, his eyes fixed on the marker as the dust swirled around it. Something about that old stone felt out of place, like a secret waiting to be uncovered. He did not know it yet, but the ground beneath his feet carried more than just memory. It carried a choice, one that would soon demand an answer. Rafi did not sleep that night. The sound of the bulldozers lingered in his ears long after they had gone silent. He sat at the kitchen table with a stack of old papers spread before him, deeds and letters passed down through his family. His hands moved over the yellowed pages, searching for something that would prove the land was still his. But each paper only reminded him how small his voice had become against the power of the HOA. The next morning he walked into the town hall, his steps slow but steady. The meeting room smelled of coffee and fresh paint, its walls covered with glossy posters of the new neighborhood that would soon replace his fields. On the stage sat the HOA board members, their faces calm, their smiles practiced. When Rafi stood and demanded an explanation, the room fell quiet for only a moment. Then came the words he had heard before, repeated like a script: legal ownership, development rights, signed approvals. They spoke quickly, smoothly, as if his anger meant nothing at all. One of the men adjusted his glasses and said, "It's all been settled, sir. Please don't interfere." Another leaned forward, his voice almost kind, telling Rafi to think of the families who would one day live there, the children who would play on land he once called his own. The room filled with polite laughter when Rafi argued back. He felt the walls closing in, the air tightening around him. The fight was no longer about truth but about control, and the board had all of it. When the meeting ended, Rafi stepped outside into the sharp daylight, his head heavy with defeat. He walked toward his truck, only to stop short. On the windshield, pinned beneath a wiper blade, was a piece of paper. Not a typed notice, not an official letter, but a rough hand-drawn map. The lines were uneven, the ink smudged, yet the drawing was clear enough. His land was sketched out, the ridge circled in bold strokes. Next to it, written in hurried letters, were two words that sent a shiver down his spine: "It remembers." Rafi looked around the lot, but no one lingered. Only strangers passed by, heading to their cars without a glance in his direction. He held the paper tight, his pulse racing. The board had smiled, the permits had spoken, but someone else knew something. Someone was watching from the edges, leaving him a message he could not yet understand. The bulldozers had taken his land, but now a darker question pressed against him: what exactly had they built on? Rafi spent the following days in silence, his mind circling back to the strange map left on his windshield. He could not ignore it. At night, he spread it across his kitchen table beside his family's old deeds. The ink marks pointed to the ridge, the same ridge where the stone marker stood. He searched the pages of his grandfather's files until his eyes blurred, hoping for some explanation. Most of the documents were simple tax receipts, property transfers, survey notes. But tucked deep in the bundle, folded and brittle with age, he found a survey dated nearly a century ago. The map on that page looked different from the modern plats the HOA had shown him. A dark line curved across the land, labeled only as reservoir boundary. His orchard was inside the line. His house was inside the line. But strangest of all, on the far side of the ridge, near the marker, was a small square labeled caretaker's cottage. It was a place Rafi had never seen in his life, though he had walked that land since boyhood. Beneath the survey, in the same folder, he found a yellowed slip of paper in his grandfather's handwriting. The ink had faded, the letters shaky, but he could still read the words: "Water keeps accounts we cannot." His chest tightened as he read it again and again. The phrase meant nothing at first, yet it seemed heavy, like a warning carried forward in time. Rafi leaned back, staring at the scattered papers. His grandfather had never spoken much about the land beyond the orchard. He remembered only fragments, half-told stories, and sudden silences whenever the ridge came up. Now those fragments came rushing back, the way his grandfather had looked at the marker with something like fear, the way he had changed the subject whenever water rights were mentioned. The more Rafi searched, the deeper the mystery grew. He visited the county archive, flipping through dusty binders that smelled of mildew and ink. Most records were clean and simple, but every so often he found gaps, missing years, missing pages, signatures that did not match. A clerk passing by muttered something about old easements and sealed files before hurrying away. When Rafi returned home that evening, he laid the map from his windshield beside the century-old survey. The circled ridge matched perfectly with the place labeled caretaker's cottage. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind, louder now: "Water keeps accounts we cannot." Rafi stepped outside, the cool night pressing in around him. He looked toward the ridge, dark against the fading sky. Somewhere out there, beyond the marker, was a secret tied to his family's land. And now he knew the bulldozers were digging closer to it every day. Rafi realized he could not face the growing mystery alone. The map, the missing records, the strange phrase from his grandfather, it all pointed to something larger than a simple land dispute. But the HOA was too powerful, and the machines outside were proof of how little his voice mattered. He needed allies, people who could help him dig where he could not. He started with the local newspaper. The editor brushed him off with a polite smile, saying the story was already too old, the permits too official. But a young reporter named Layla stopped him at the door. Her notebook was tucked under her arm, her eyes sharp with curiosity. "You said you had proof?" she asked. Rafi nodded. Later that night, he spread his papers across her small desk, the yellowed survey and the strange note. She read in silence, her expression changing from doubt to concern. "This isn't just about land," she whispered. "This looks like a cover-up." Next, Rafi reached out to an old friend of his father's, a retired surveyor named Malik. The man had spent his life drawing maps and measuring land no one else cared about. When Rafi showed him the old survey, Malik frowned. "That line shouldn't be there," he said, pointing to the reservoir boundary. "If it was drawn, it means the water rights existed. And if they existed, they don't just vanish." He tapped the paper with a stiff finger. "Someone buried this." Finally, Rafi met with a young lawyer, Nadia, who had once fought against the HOA in a smaller case and lost. She still carried the sting of that defeat. When Rafi showed her the deeds and the phrase from his grandfather, she agreed to look deeper. Within a week, she returned with copies of contracts pulled from the county office. "The signatures don't match," she told him. "Half these approvals were rushed through at night. The same man signed 3 different names. Someone wanted this done fast, and they didn't care how." Together, the three of them began to connect the pieces. Late-night approvals, irregular signatures, contractors who had failed inspections but still won bids. Every trail pointed back to the same group of people, the HOA board. And at the center of it all was one name, repeated again and again, hidden in the fine print. But as they worked, strange things began to happen. Layla's phone went dead during an interview with a former clerk. Malik noticed a car following him home at night. Nadia's office was broken into, though nothing was stolen. Rafi felt the weight pressing harder. They were close to something, but every step forward made the shadows around them grow darker. One evening, Malik arrived at Rafi's house with his hands shaking. He placed a folder on the table and whispered, "They know we're looking." The construction site did not slow down. If anything, it grew louder, busier, more restless. Trucks came at odd hours, unloading materials long after dark. Rafi watched from the ridge as floodlights burned against the night sky, turning his once quiet valley into a stage of restless shadows. The workers moved quickly, but not all of them looked like builders. Some arrived in unmarked vans, staying close to a sealed shed at the far edge of the property. They carried boxes inside but never brought anything out. Layla managed to get drone footage one evening, though the battery drained faster than it should have. When they reviewed the images, the sealed shed stood out, new locks, reinforced doors, no windows. A man in a suit appeared in 2 frames, though he was never listed among the contractors. "That's not construction crew," Malik said flatly. "That's someone making sure secrets stay hidden." The tension grew heavier. The air around the site seemed charged, as if everyone knew they were being watched. One night, a nearby farmer shared a clip from his security camera. The grainy footage showed a single figure moving toward the ridge after midnight. The person carried a small light and disappeared near the place marked as the old caretaker's cottage on Rafi's survey. Rafi's pulse quickened. He had walked that ridge dozens of times, yet he had never found the cottage. Now someone else was searching for it. The warnings came quietly. A rock thrown through Layla's car window, a note taped to Nadia's office door with only 2 words, "Stop digging." Malik swore he was followed by a dark SUV all the way to his house. The pressure was no longer just on Rafi, it was reaching everyone who stood beside him. Then came the discovery. Nadia found a half-burned stack of papers in a construction dumpster, edges charred black. Most of the text was lost, but one word remained clear, stamped in bold across a surviving sheet: insurance. She spread the fragment on the table as they all stared. "This isn't just about houses," she said. "They're setting something up. Something big." Rafi felt the room grow colder. The word pulsed in his mind, tying itself to his grandfather's warning and the map of the ridge. Insurance meant money, money tied to risk. But what risk were they planning for? He looked at the others, each face pale in the glow of the single lamp. The bulldozers outside were carving new streets, but the real foundation being laid was something none of them could yet see. And for the first time, Rafi wondered if the secret buried in his land was not just history, but a weapon waiting to be used. The deeper they looked, the stranger the story became. Nadia spent long nights combing through property records and county agreements, piecing together documents the HOA had hoped no one would ever see. One clause, buried in a forgotten easement, made her stop cold. The development permits were valid only because of an old water rights agreement tied directly to the ridge. Without that easement, the HOA had no authority to build at all. And worse, the agreement had been quietly voided years earlier by a private settlement that was never recorded publicly. On paper, their entire project was a fraud. Malik examined the surveys again, tracing the lines with a pencil. "They ignored this on purpose," he muttered. "That reservoir boundary isn't just a mistake. It's the key to the land. Whoever controls the water controls the future of this valley." He circled the ridge with firm strokes. And they built over it like it didn't exist. Layla chased another lead, interviewing a former contractor who agreed to talk only in the corner of a dim diner. The man's voice shook as he described cut corners, skipped inspections, and pressure from above. "We were told to keep quiet," he whispered. "They wanted it done fast. Didn't matter if it was safe. Didn't matter if it was legal. He slid a napkin across the table with a single name scribbled on it, the same name Nadia had seen again and again on the falsified contracts. A director on the HOA board, one who had grown strangely wealthy since the project began. But before Layla could ask more, the man's eyes darted to the window. A black car idled across the street. He stood abruptly, leaving his coffee half full, and walked out the back without looking back. Layla left with only the napkin and the unease that someone else was always listening. The pieces were coming together: voided easements, forged signatures, rushed permits, and now a board member at the center of it all. But the more they uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't just greed. It was planning. Something about the sealed shed, the midnight activity, and the insurance papers spoke of a scheme larger than stolen land. Then came the breaking news. Rafi turned on the radio one evening to hear the announcer's voice cutting through static. Local authorities have sealed the office of HOA Director Kamal Siddiq for investigation following an undisclosed incident. No details, no explanation, only the promise of more to come. Rafi's blood ran cold. The man whose name was written on every fraudulent paper, the one who seemed untouchable, was suddenly under lock and key. But was it because of what he had done, or because someone wanted to silence him before he revealed too much? Rafi stood at the edge of his field, watching the frames of new houses rise against the horizon. Each day brought more walls, more roofs, more strangers hammering nails into the land that had once been his. The papers, the maps, the warnings, they were all piling up, but the machines did not stop. The HOA had power, money, and time on their side. All Rafi had was a crumbling past and a choice he had not yet dared to make. Nadia urged him to stay patient, to let the investigation unfold. Layla pressed for one more interview, one more lead that might break the story wide open. Malik shook his head, warning them all that men with money did not fall from evidence alone. They bury truth deeper than foundations, he said. And they pour concrete over it. His words echoed in Rafi's mind long after the conversation ended. At night, Rafi walked alone to the ridge. The stone marker stood silent under the moonlight, its faint letters glowing pale. He crouched beside it, tracing the grooves with his hand. The word reserve seemed almost alive, whispering at him through the years. His grandfather's phrase returned to him again, steady and insistent: "Water keeps accounts we cannot." That was when he heard it, the sound of water, faint but clear, somewhere beneath the ridge. It was not the wind. It was not the earth shifting. It was a hollow echo, deep and steady, like a promise waiting to be kept. Rafi pressed his ear to the ground, heart pounding. The land was alive, and it was holding something he did not fully understand. As he stood, a flash of light caught his eye. A vehicle moved along the far road, its headlights cutting across the valley. For a moment, Rafi thought it might be another survey crew, but the car slowed near the sealed shed. Two men got out, their figures black against the floodlight glow. They carried tools, heavy and deliberate, vanishing into the shadows of the structure. They weren't building, they were preparing. Rafi's breath came fast. He was running out of time. The HOA wasn't just careless, they were setting something in motion. And now, with the director under investigation, someone else had taken control. The land that had once been his was no longer just stolen property, it was bait, part of a plan he could barely see. He returned home and sat in the dark, the map on his table, the word insurance burning in his mind. He had spent weeks fighting with paper, with words, with truth. But the ground beneath him whispered of another answer, one written not in ink but in water. For the first time, he let himself think it, perhaps the only way to stop them was to release what the land had been holding all along. The storm came without warning, rolling over the valley in waves of black clouds and jagged light. Rain hammered the rooftops of half-built homes, turning raw soil into rivers of mud. Rafi stood on the ridge, soaked to the bone, his heart thundering with the sky. Below him, the machines sat idle in the rain, their hulking shapes like monsters caught sleeping. The lights from the new houses glowed dim through the downpour, fragile against the dark. He had told himself he only wanted to see. To stand at the ridge and remember what was his. But the sound of the water beneath the ground had grown louder with each passing night. The stone marker loomed beside him, its carved word shining faint in the lightning flashes. Reserve. A warning. A promise. Or perhaps a key. His hands trembled as he touched the rusted hatch half buried near the marker, something he had only dared to uncover days earlier. The metal was stiff, but the storm had loosened the earth. Water roared below, no longer faint, but a living voice demanding release. Rafi hesitated, rain running into his eyes. He thought of his grandfather's words, of Nadia's warnings, of Layla's restless search for truth. He thought of Malik saying the truth was buried in concrete. Perhaps water was the only thing strong enough to break it free. With a final pull, the hatch gave way. The ground shuddered as the first surge escaped, a blast of cold air rushing upward. Then came the flood. It roared out of the ridge with a force older than the valley itself, tearing through the earth like claws. Rafi stumbled back, staring in awe and horror as the water poured downhill, a living river cutting across streets and foundations. Below, lights flickered. Workers shouted, their voices swallowed by the storm. Families inside the nearest homes scrambled as the water rushed past, sweeping away fences, posts, and tools. The flood carried more than rain, it carried the weight of years, secrets pried loose from the soil. In one violent sweep, it tore open trenches the HOA had buried, dragging up ledgers and papers sealed in plastic, spilling them across the mud. Rafi stood frozen, rain blinding his eyes, his chest heavy with the enormity of what he had done. This was no small act of anger, it was an awakening. Sirens wailed in the distance, red lights flashing through the storm. And then, through the blur of rain, he saw something that stopped his breath. On the far side of the ridge, a second figure slipped out of the darkness, running away from the hatch. Rafi was not alone. Someone else had been there before him. The flood roared on, carrying truth and destruction in equal measure, and the night swallowed both his triumph and his fear. When the storm finally passed, the valley looked nothing like it had before. The neat rows of new houses were broken, their foundations torn open by the rushing flood. Streets that had been carefully carved by machines were now trenches of mud and stone. The water had receded, but it left behind scars that could not be hidden. Rafi stood on the ridge at dawn, staring at the wreckage below. The silence was heavy, broken only by the distant wail of sirens. But the flood had revealed more than destruction. Across the churned mud lay fragments of boxes, plastic-wrapped files, and ledgers that the water had ripped free from their hiding places. Pages fluttered in the wind, stamped with numbers, signatures, and names that should have never been buried. Layla was the first to arrive, her camera in hand. She captured everything, the torn documents, the scattered receipts, the permits and signed but approved. Evidence the HOA could never explain away. By afternoon, the internet was flooded with her story. Images of the mud-soaked ledgers spread across social media. Reporters circled like hawks, demanding answers the board could not give. Neighbors who once stayed silent now gathered in crowds, shouting for justice. Some called Rafi a criminal, blaming him for the destruction. Others whispered that he had exposed what no one else dared to see. Yet one detail unsettled him most. Among the papers Layla collected was a ledger entry marked for payouts tied to a single word, insurance. The sum was enormous, more than the value of the homes themselves. It wasn't just greed. It was a scheme built to profit from disaster. The flood had uncovered the rot, but it also hinted that someone had expected it all along. That night, Nadia brought shocking news. A video had been leaked anonymously to several news outlets. The grainy footage showed the control house at the ridge, hours before the storm hit. Two figures appeared in the clip, one of them Rafi, unmistakable in the rain. But another man had been there earlier, entering the hatch and leaving before the flood began. The video cut off abruptly, but the implication was clear: the disaster had not been the act of one man alone. Rafi sat in silence as the others argued about what it meant. Malik swore it proved someone else had triggered the chain of events. Layla insisted it showed the corruption reached deeper than they imagined. Nadia warned that the video could just as easily be twisted, turning Rafi from a whistleblower into a scapegoat. As the night deepened, Rafi realized the truth was no longer his alone. The flood had exposed the secrets buried in the land, but it had also unleashed questions too dangerous to answer. Who was the second figure on the ridge? And had the flood been an accident of revenge or part of a plan far larger than him? the valley became a battlefield of voices. By the end of the week, every screen carried the story: the washed out homes, the exposed ledgers, the whispers of fraud, and the video that showed Rafi on the ridge. Crowds filled the courthouse steps. Some carried signs calling him a hero, a man who had revealed corruption hidden for years. Others shouted for his arrest, pointing to the wreckage left behind, to families now homeless and businesses ruined. Investigations spread quickly. Subpoenas were served to the HOA board members. 2 were taken into custody, accused of falsifying permits and burying financial records. The name of Kamal Siddiq, the director whose office had been sealed, dominated headlines. Some claimed he had orchestrated the insurance scheme, planning to profit when the development failed. Others suggested he had been silenced because he knew too much. But with Kamal out of sight and the board scrambling for cover, the truth was tangled deeper than ever. For Rafi, there was no peace. Nadia fought to protect him legally, arguing that the flood had exposed crimes larger than his own actions. Layla's articles painted him as the reluctant whistleblower, a man driven to extremes after being stripped of everything. Yet the leaked video divided opinion. The sight of that second figure, slipping away into the storm, fueled endless debate. Was Rafi manipulated into triggering something already planned? Or had someone else ensured the flood would happen whether he acted or not? Malik visited him often, his voice heavy with regret. "Water remembers," he said quietly. "But people forget too quickly. They will decide what you are, not the truth." Rafi could only nod, staring at the ridge that still loomed over his land. The hatch was sealed again by authorities, guarded and chained. But he knew what was beneath it, and he knew it was not finished. Weeks passed. The land changed once more. Where streets had been carved, shallow pools now shimmered in the sun. Birds returned to the water, their wings flashing white against the sky. Children came to watch them, laughter carrying faintly over the valley. To some, it looked like nature reclaiming its place. To others, it was a scar that would never heal. Rafi sat at dawn on the ridge, his boots muddy, his eyes fixed on the water below. He had exposed the corruption, but the cost weighed heavy. Friends were threatened, enemies remained hidden, and the question of who had truly unleashed the flood lingered like a shadow. The world now knew the valley's secret, yet the answer it demanded was unfinished. The water moved quietly in the low light, steady and endless. Rafi whispered his grandfather's words one last time: "Water keeps accounts we cannot," and as the sun rose, he realized those accounts were far from settled.